Here is the rewritten script with some words changed while keeping the same structure, style, and word count. Emmanuel Macron just declared that Europe can no longer rely on the United States for security or economic stability. He told European newspapers that the world is, and I'm quoting here, increasingly afraid of the American dollar, and that the US is another, quote, distancing itself further and further from a state of law. This is not diplomatic criticism. This is France's president publicly stating that American institutional credibility has collapsed to the point where Europe must build alternatives. I'm L of House of L on YouTube. I have a PhD in computer science and I use data analysis to spot patterns in geopolitics and economics. The pattern here is categorical. Europe's largest economy partners are systematically decoupling from American-led frameworks because they've concluded that dependence on US systems creates unacceptable strategic vulnerability. Macron told a group of European newspapers that Europe faces a wake-up call in the face of growing threats from China, Russia, and now the United States. He explicitly listed America alongside authoritarian regimes as a threat vector. When the president of France publicly categorizes the United States as a source of instability equivalent to Russia and China, that is not rhetorical posturing. That is European strategic doctrine being rewritten in real time. The financial mechanism is explicit here. Macron said, and I'm quoting again, "The world markets are increasingly afraid of the American greenback. They want alternatives." He's calling for Eurobonds, EU-wide shared debt instruments that would establish a European alternative to US Treasury bonds. According to Macron, the 27-member EU needed €1.2 trillion per year to invest in security and defense, clean energy, and artificial intelligence. But here's what makes this particularly significant. $1.2 trillion annually is approximately the size of Australia's entire GDP. Macron is proposing that Europe create financing capacity equivalent to a G20 economy specifically to reduce dependence on American systems. This is not incremental reform. This is essentially Europe building parallel infrastructure at scale. The institutional critique is direct. Macron said, and I'm quoting him again here, "For investors everywhere, a democratic state of law is a huge attraction. And when I look at the world as it is, we have the authoritarian regime that is China. And on the other side, we have the US distancing itself further and further from a state of law." The president of France just told global investors, all of us, that America no longer qualifies as a reliable rule of law jurisdiction. And when you work in finance long enough, you understand that this kind of statement from a G7 leader has market implications, significant ones. Macron is signaling to sovereign wealth funds, pension managers, and central banks that European debt instruments will be positioned as the democratic rule of law alternative to both Chinese authoritarianism and American institutional volatility. For those tracking how this connects to broader financial decoupling, check my video on China ordering a massive bond sell-off. The mechanisms are converging here. Both Europe and China are constructing alternatives to dollar-denominated assets, and they're doing it simultaneously from opposite ends of the geopolitical spectrum. The Greenland context also matters a great deal. Macron warned Europeans not to believe that Trump backing down from Greenland threats means the crisis is over, saying, "Don't believe it for a single second." That's another quote. He described a specific pattern. There are threats and intimidation, and then suddenly Washington gives way and people think it's over. But Macron is essentially teaching European policymakers to interpret American behavior as cyclically unstable rather than strategically coherent. By the way, if you're finding it hard to track what is real versus what's performative politics anymore, that is exactly why critical thinking skills matter. My book, Awake, The Practice of Critical Thinking in an Age of Soft Lies, breaks down how to identify when you're being manipulated by information overload versus when you're seeing genuine institutional failure. It's available in ebook and audiobook. Subscribers get 10% off, and you can get the first chapter for free using the links in the description. The implication is very clear in my opinion. Even when specific crises de-escalate, the underlying institutional volatility remains. Therefore, Europe must build systems that function independently of American predictability or unpredictability. The defense implications are massive for this one. Macron is explicitly arguing that Europe can no longer assume American security guarantees are permanent. He said, and I'm quoting him again here, "The US, which we thought would guarantee our security forever, is no longer sure. When France states that American defense commitments are unreliable, that is not a complaint. That is a justification for building independent European military capacity. The $1.2 trillion euro annual investment Macron is proposing would fund European defense infrastructure, AI development, and clean energy, all sectors where Europe currently relies on American technology or security frameworks. This is systematic strategic autonomy across every dimension of state power. For more on how European institutions are restructuring to reduce American dependencies, check out my video on how Europe is essentially building payment systems to replace Visa and MasterCard. The pattern is identical. European leaders have concluded that American control over critical infrastructure creates leverage that can be weaponized. The economic positioning is quite sophisticated, in my opinion. Macron said there is growing demand in the world's financial markets for mutualized European debt, which currently the EU was not equipped to supply. He's arguing that global investors want alternatives to US treasuries, but Europe hasn't yet built the instruments to capture that demand. If Macron succeeds in creating Eurobonds backed by the full EU, that creates a KOA-rated sovereign debt instrument with a larger economic base than the United States. The EU's combined GDP is approximately 18 trillion versus America's 28 trillion, but the EU population is 450 million versus America's 335 million people. European debt instruments would offer comparable scale with what Macron is positioning as superior rule of law stability. The competitive framing is explicit here. Macron said, and I'm quoting him again, "The Chinese do it, the Americans too." Europe today is the most open market in the world. He's calling for European preference industrial policy that prioritizes European content and manufacturing. This includes made in Europe strategies that would set minimum requirements for European content in locally manufactured goods. And this directly challenges American and Chinese market access. If Europe implements domestic content requirements equivalent to what America and China already have, that shifts trillions in procurement spending towards European suppliers. American exporters would lose preferential access to a market larger than the United States. Here's the pattern that I'm tracking here. Macron is using Trump's institutional volatility as political cover to advance reforms that Germany and Northern European countries have historically resisted. Shared European debt has been politically impossible for decades. But now, Macron is framing it as an existential security requirement because America cannot really be trusted anymore, and that timeline is showing urgency. Macron warned, if we do nothing, Europe will be swept away in 5 years. That's not hyperbole for domestic consumption. That is a French president telling European finance ministers they have a 5-year window to build independent capacity before geopolitical fractures make it impossible for sure. The institutional mechanics do matter as well. The EU used joint debt in 2020 for COVID recovery, but making it permanent has faced German resistance. Macron is using US hostility now as justification, telling investors that world markets are increasingly wary of the US dollar and should look to European debt as an alternative. For those of you tracking whether American power fractures accelerate or stabilize, check out my video on the 3 reasons why this power grab will likely fail. In my view, the mechanisms show consistent patterns. Once again, when allies start building alternatives to American systems, it signals that they've concluded American institutional stability is unreliable. Here are my predictions on this one. I think that by 2028, the EU will launch Eurobonds worth at least 500 billion euros annually. European defense spending will probably increase by 40%, and American influence over European economic policy will likely drop below Cold War levels. The pattern that we're watching is not European protectionism. I think it's more European institutions concluding that American volatility has made continued dependence strategically untenable. Macron will push this at the EU summit this week. I think the question is whether Germany agrees to share debt or whether France proceeds with a coalition of Southern European countries. Either way, the direction is set. Europe is building capacity to function as an independent pole of power, specifically because it no longer trusts American institutions. For more on how confidence in American institutional competence is collapsing across allied governments, check out the video on screen right now. Macron's statements are just the most explicit articulation of what European policymakers are pricing into their long-term strategic planning. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.